Final Fantasy. The first game in the series was released in 1987 for the Family Computer in Japan, and it didn't make its way across the ocean to North America until 1990 with its NES release. A standout in the gaming market and the progenitor of a prolific series of renowned hard-hitting games. In the year of our Lord 2024, I want to talk about Final Fantasy I.
The following video does contain spoilers for the original Final Fantasy, as well as frank discussions of the legacy that follows. Stop here if you want to go out and play the Pixel Remaster, which will be discussed in detail here, or any other Final Fantasy games before continuing on. Don't worry, this video will be here in 20 to 800 hours when you get back.
If I said I enjoyed the series, that would be a polite understatement. I do have a tendency to go a bit rabid over a good turn-based RPG. The culmination of my love of the Ren Fair, my lack of fine-tuned hand-eye coordination, and my early proclivity for choose-your-own-adventure books puts me in the prime demographic of adults looking to return to this 40-year-old series with 16 mainline games, as many if not more spin-off games, books, manga, tie-in movies, and anime. Coming from a predominantly pen-and-paper creative background, there was something easy to engage with about the Final Fantasy franchise. What isn't to love about reoccurring, if sometimes unimportant, tropes and universal elements, meaning versatile character archetypes with interesting backstories? The focus on environmental activism, the effects of trauma, the importance of friendship, and the ruthless nature of power are elements of other media I've loved over the years. It's hard to find a video game enjoyer who doesn't have at least a passive knowledge of the series, if not one game in particular. Meanwhile, finding a gamer with a particular favorite is like finding an apple when bobbing for apples. Mine is 9. I know objectively it has a lot of issues, but I refuse to take notes. Thank you. Especially now with the continued success of award-winning MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV and the second installment of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, Rebirth, the series' social currency is on the rise, regardless of the state of company shares. But where did this legacy begin? Why am I talking about it, and why are you here? Not to retread, but I think I've covered that middle one, and that last one's on you, bud. I'm here to talk about the Final Fantasy series, game by game, until we've reached the answer to the question, objectively and 100% correctly, what is the best game in the Final Fantasy franchise, using metrics that I will be coming up with through this series of replaying the games and making these videos. Scientific. I know. Thank you. I will also attempt to learn what truly makes a Square game of Final Fantasy and what other games encapsulate the same spirit. If that doesn't sound exhilarating, I don't know what to tell you. It was all right there in the title. You can go. Dismissed. If that sounds like so much fun that you physically cannot contain yourself and you still like me by the end of this video, then come hang out while I play the rest of them over on Twitch at twitch.tv/unlucky_clover. So, first things first, plot breakdown. Arise, the first warriors of light, in the only game where you can not only name your unnamed group of companions, but also select their jobs, which cannot and will not change throughout the course of the game. While this is very Dungeons & Dragons coded, it is an element of the core games that you will not see again, at least not very often. Most Final Fantasy games give the player some leniency in how they formulate their party and train elements of their party members' jobs, but this amount of pure and lasting customization is rare. After a brief introduction to a world slowly dying due to the dying crystals trope that is part and parcel with much of the franchise, we're told of the coming of, well, us. A group of adventurers foretold by Liu Khan, prophecy, also very Final Fantasy, who would be able to restore the crystals to power and save the world. But first, you have to save the king's daughter from the Temple of Chaos and Garland, one of his best knights, who has suddenly become a vicious turncoat. Why, you ask? Visit the Witch Montoya to learn of her missing eye, halt the pirate takeover of the trading town Provoca, for which you are bestowed a ship, visit the sleeping Elven Prince, the Elven King in the Western Keep, defeat the piss demons of the marsh to return the crown to the corrupted king, who you have to beat to receive the eye to give to the witch, who gives you a jolt potion to awaken the Elven Prince, who then gives you a key to obtain some great treasures, one of which is nitro powder that must be given to the mining dwarves of Mount Dwergar,
Lolly Ho, who explode a tunnel to give you access to the wider ocean. From there, you go to your first real dungeon, the Cavern of Earth, where you must defeat a vampire who gives you a ruby that you have to feed to Titan. Then report to Sada the Sage. He'll give you the earthen rod to access the fight against the Lich, who's feeding on the Earth Crystal's energy. Putting him in an overdue grave is how you'll cleanse the Earth Crystal and save the small town of Melmond. Got all that? That was Crystal 1. Notice anything missing? Plot? Character development? Sure. Needed? No. Now go on and kill some more big eyes and fish. Find your way to a lake that looks like a crescent. Speak to the 12 sages and the man who foretold your coming in order to receive the mythical, life-changing canoe. The sages give you a smaller boat. With said smaller boat, you can now traverse rivers, which allows you to go to Mount Golg, or Home of the Fire Crystal. Here, you fight a bunch of lava and lava-based critters in order to finally face off against the sexy snake lady, Merilith. Her 4 swords should be no match for your party of anywhere between 0 and 4 swords. Her defeat lets you access and cleanse the Fire Crystal. That's 2 crystals done and dusted. At this plot-allotted halfway point, why don't we take a tally of all of the Final Fantasy brickwork we've seen so far as a means of an intermission. While we may not have the draw of plot or character backstories that we do in some of the later games, we do have the basic premise of most Final Fantasy games. A group of above-average schmoes beset with saving the world from the destruction of all time and space. Don't worry. We'll get there. And while we may not have seen any franchise staples like the Moogle, Chocobo, or Cactuar, I know how it is pronounced now, but I refuse to say Cactuar just because they've added voice actors in the last 40 years, okay? In fact, I might say Sabatender just to be subversive. The original also apparently lacked the iconic Phoenix Downs and required you to use the town temples to resurrect party members. This was shortly fixed in the re-releases we'll talk about a little bit later. That being said, we still see the basics of fantasy all around us, final or otherwise. Giants, dragons, dwarves, elves, magic crystals, and a gold-based system utilizing gil, speaking of. Just like early pen and paper games, it's a little bit more difficult to kit out your magic users at level 1. Us humans hadn't really figured out how teaching yourself magic could be applied to a level up mechanic just yet. The first of the Final Fantasy series requires you to buy all of your mage's magic, meaning until you've purchased your first spell, your mages are just robed townsfolk along for the ride. This is not repeated in most of the following games, at least not for Gil. We transfer over to an XP-based magic system, which in most cases still makes you pay either in materia slots or skill placement, which gives your mages a more natural feel. This is similar to a lot of tabletop role-playing games, which changed their magic system to include the ability to find, fix, or buy scrolls and items that work alongside a more balanced XP-based increase in spell slots. We will eventually be introduced to some of our easily identifiable reoccurring characters and plot points. Oh, I almost forgot to use this well. We will see it again. This is a well stan account, and if you have anti-well sentiment, see yourself out. We wish you well. At this point in the game, we've also heard tell of airships, a highlight throughout all of the games, most of which follow a similar path of allowing you to access the land exhibited in your world map bit by bit without limiting your view of said map from jump. There's no need to unveil it, but rather the player's enticed with exploration and introduced to locations and progression through means of transportation. In one's case, going from walking to sailing to paddling and onwards to flying. Honestly, the first Final Fantasy is one of the smoother ones as far as level progression and story beats, which is not really a hot take once we get into the 7s and 9s of the world. But it suffers in the way that a large chunk of early games did. There's not too much as far as intricate plot, and the way in which they direct the player to said story is sometimes questionable. Instead of a marker on a minimap, the player must explore the edges of the map themselves, talking to townsfolk to get a lay of the land, and sometimes even revisiting areas of the map that had previously been marked as completed or uninteresting, with no overworld marking to explain that to the player, which I honestly love. Even as an experienced player, you can find yourself making a misstep, but because of your landlocked or travel restrictions at any given time, it isn't hard to correct. maybe just a bit frustrating if you forget anything, but I like needing to interact with the world to progress the plot. It ends up making the world feel a lot more lived in, and it sticks around as a series staple until somewhere in the teens. How do we move forward from Mount Gulg and the Snake Lady with, like, way too many arms? Did you think it was to complete the other 2 crystal dungeons, save the world, and be celebrated? Wrong. Diversion time. First, right after Mount Gulg, you'll head north to an ice cavern, unaffiliated with any crystal, as ice is not a primary element. Idiot. Here you'll find the Levystone, which when brought to the nearby desert will reveal the airship! Free reign of the map, baby! Kinda. Neglecting the high price of finding a parking space for this honker. Did you forget the whole other continent we haven't explored? Well, saddle up, cowpokes. We got some sploring to do. Next, you'll want to stop at the mountain town of Jaya and the oceanside town of Onrak to talk to the people who know the area better than you. Things are a little more confusing up here in the north.
Oh my god, what is that? Oh my god! What is that?
You'll want to go to the King of the Dragons, Baby Boy Bahamut's first appearance, in his underground fortress of subterraneanly connected butthole-looking islands. He'll tell you to get back in your airship and get to the Citadel of Trials, complete an infuriating teleportation maze, which is almost as frustrating as the recent parking mechanic you've had to pick up to receive a rat tail, which has some speculated meanings, which we'll go over in, I don't know, 3 years when I'm done replaying and researching and re-editing all of this footage. Anyway, bring the rat tail to Bahamut, who grants you titles, making you better versions of yourself. If only it was that easy IRL. Now, with a knight, master ninja, or wizard in tow, you can make more attacks, buy all available spells, and use more of the unlockable and purchasable weapons and armor. Yay! More importantly, give it up for those sick-ass makeovers. Now, with that out of the way, on to some more confusing rigmarole. If you can park your fucking ship. If you remember what the people of Jaya said about someone selling a ferry they found to the desert caravan, and the people of Onrak said about the proximity to said desert caravan, then you'll immediately head to the right spot in the right desert, which is indicated on your map by a small group of trees. Where after stocking up on your new gear for your fully upgraded party members, you hopefully have held on to 40,000 gil in order to buy said ferry back. Once that's all sorted, by whatever means necessary, head back to Jaya to release the ferry, follow it back to a pond clearing in town, receive Oxiale, then head right back to Onrak to prove to a woman who wishes to protect the unsubstantiated mermaids on the ocean floor with her shitty submarine that you can now create airflow in said shitty submarine with your newest received object to divert her stupid-ass mission and head to the sunken water temple at the bottom of the sea.
Or so you thought.
Surprise! This chick up and proselytizes at you and then disappears.
She was a mermaid, if you didn't get that. Her girlies will tell you all about it at the water temple.
Because your goals are fully aligned, go save that water crystal, girl. Find the Rosetta Stone so you can presumably talk to the peeps in the town that confound the people of Jaya since they can't understand the language. Then head on down to Kraken Town. Or rather, up. And the Kraken in question, he looks different from traditional Kraken. For sure. Now with that water crystal done, count 'em, 3, head up to the northern waterfall based on the suspicions of some guy named Cope, where a golem will hand you a warp cube and some cryptic instructions. This allows for teleportation between the Mirage Tower and the Flying Fortress. Don't worry, we'll get there. You forgot about that Rosetta Stone, didn't ya? Well, if you remember where the only man in the whole world who studied the languages lives, head there, or meticulously revisit every town speaking to various townsfolk to find him, or look it up online. No one needs to know.
But I will, you cheater.
So he can miraculously make you fluent in Lufenian. Then go back to the foreign land of Lufenia, where you'll get a lore drop, baby. And what does that include? First Sid mentioned. Not only that, but they'll tell you the first get juked upon secreter, bigger, badder bad guy. And then they'll give you chimes to let you into a different tower, the Mirage Tower, which you can only be forced to assume is the unexplored tower in the other desert you've yet to touch down in. I mean, touch down around and run into, because
For obvious reasons, you can't park on sand. Use the chimes given to you by your Lufian friends to clear that ground tower, then open up the sky tower with the warp cube. Clear that second tower and defeat the first Tiamat insert to get the fourth crystal. While up there, a well-placed window shows you that you must go back to the Chaos Tower. Yes, where you fought Garland and saved the princess at the very jump of the game. You should go back to the Dwarven blacksmith to have them create Excalibur from that piece of adamantine you found, but that's neither here nor there plot-wise, and also not helpful if you don't have a warrior or want to 100% the game. Once there, your lore-drop and Lufian friends come in clutch again, but this time as warriors transformed into bats. Unimportant. Get teleported to the past, 2,000 years to be exact. Do a small boss rush of the 4 fiends and find that this point in time is when Garland, yes, that Garland, who is now Chaos Incarnate, started this whole cycle in which his perverse current past form was created when the fiends sent him back from the future, so he could in turn send the fiends from the past to the right point in time to start the cycle of sending each other backwards and forwards through time. And that's it. Beat chaos, break the cycle, use light only for creation and not destruction. Congratulations. An epilogue will roll now. The first Final Fantasy was released alongside many series staples of the 80s and 90s, and even includes a snarky little shot fired at everyone's favorite elf boy, emblematic of Final Fantasy's spot in video game culture. It might seem hard to say whether or not it was a standout, except it isn't hard to say that. The reception of the first in the series was positive in both Japan and America, with many comparisons to Dragon Quest, and detractors negatively comparing it to Legend of Zelda, dismissing the random encounter system as an oppositional playstyle to the puzzles and lair layouts of other action-adventure games at the time. With the random encounters making up so much of the gameplay, it doesn't feel as tempting as other Final Fantasy installments to run from encounters and grind later. In fact, I think it does a really good job of keeping the player on track as far as currency and XP by the time they get to each crystal dungeon. Some dungeons you'll face a little overpowered, but not have enough gil for the preceding town, and vice versa. The versatility of the party composition is also pretty interesting. The first time I played through 1, I chose the controversial team, in so much that any group of 4 is controversial in this game, of 3 mages and a monk. The second time I played through, I leaned on the suggestion of warrior, thief, white mage, and black mage, primarily because I wanted to get a chance to use Excalibur. There's nothing worse than hearing a little achievement ding when you've unlocked one of the best weapons in the game that's been previously hinted at by characters, and you can't use it. Almost every class has an optimal gear set that you'll be building towards throughout your gameplay. While the gear does seem relatively balanced, remembering that spells do count as gear more or less, there does seem to be a heavier tilt towards your marshals, specifically your warrior, picking up good loot throughout the various dungeons. We see a lot less gear shuffling between your mages and light gear users until after you've received your promotion. And while some of the gear you pick up is helpful for specific dungeons, see the Ice and Fire sets, you don't find winning or losing as dependent on resistances and weapon options as you do in some later installments. There are considerations and guides for just about any party online, and with some of the speedrunning champions taking 2 red mages along for the ride, you can make just about any team work for you. The only parties people consider challenging are any with 4 of one job, or allowing 3 of your party members to die so you can do a solo run. Honestly, if I were to play Final Fantasy 1 again, I would probably run Monk, Warrior, Black Mage, Red Mage, really tie my 2 experiences together and create a team that could really mess shit up. Although a monk without a full white mage might suffer and would probably rely heavily on grinding early and maintaining stacks of healing items, although there are reasons to try to keep your monk at a low level until they become a black belt or a master, depending on the version you're playing. I actually didn't see a breakdown for this comp when I was doing research online. Maybe I'll play this game again. Before we get to our final section, let's do a penultimate chat to sit down and talk about the differences between the Pixel Remaster and other iterations of the game. As it's been around for a handful of years longer than I have, there's been time for tweaks and improvements. These will not impact the game's final standing in the ranks. Along the way, there were some much-needed quality-of-life upgrades. Losing on-screen character limits, explorable shops, cutscenes utilizing in-game sprites, redirecting hits, quick saves, unlearning spells, enemy difficulty balancing, and more fantastic reworks to the music. There was also some relocalization work done with later versions of the game.
Additional art was added in easy mode, and other various sundries can now be found in the menu. In 2000, with the WonderSwan release, we saw the addition of the highly iconic title and menu art associated with many of the Final Fantasy games. See the recently released 16 for an example of how tied the title art is to the series, only to realize that it was a later addition to the original. The Pixel Remaster is the version I specifically played, and it's the easiest to access as it's available through Steam. Resolution and filter options are appreciated by streamers and casual players alike. The art and the implementation of auto-battler and more open map spaces makes walking around the world and doing the extensive number of way too easy fights around endgame easier and more user-friendly. Everything is cheaper as per earlier iterations' easy mode. This may have caused a head turn or two when I referred to the 40,000 gil ferry that was originally 50,000 gil in the OG game and some iterations since. We got a rare deflation of prices with time. On to some of the negatives. The maps are super open, to a point where exploration and punishment for said exploration within a dungeon feel so redundant they rarely, if ever, happen. The monsters lost some of their balance that they found in other versions of the game in both good and bad ways. This can make preparing for some of the fights very difficult, but I didn't personally run into any portion of the game that punished me severely for being underprepared for any reason. Some cutscenes have been removed, but they did leave a handful in to delight the player. Rework after rework, and I'd honestly say that there's still room for improvement. But I'm an editor, I would say that about everything. I know it's a character flaw. Still, if they did a re-release, I'd play it. Finally, we've arrived at the final segment. What you've been waiting for, I'm sure. That's right. It's tier list time, baby. A note. These metrics will grow and change as we continue to see the series and its core intentions evolve throughout the years. We will revisit it if the metrics change in coming videos. Here's where we stand now with the blocks that Final Fantasy I has given us. No more funny bits, antagonistic comments, distracting camera changes, just a straightforward discussion. So far, we'll be grading on 4 categories: level progression, music, story, and use of tropes. How Final Fantasy ranks is as follows.
Boo! 2020 style screen share zoom jump scare for ya is the last bit.
Level progression. It is simple but effective. The fights are quite regular and the need for grinding is minimal, outside of the ill-prepared. Especially with the gil gouging written out of the Pixel Remaster, you'll rarely, if ever, hit a stumbling block. There's still a lot of tweaking that could be done to balance everything further, but it isn't necessary for you to have a good time. Overall, it gets an A. Music. The beginning of the series brings with it the beginning of an unending, repeatable list of Nobu Uematsu's bangers. Every one of them is a winner that at no point gets on the nerves. S. Always. I mean, we'll see about that. That being said, I think music cannot be a consideration until I've found a game that has a distinctly worse soundtrack. So, for the sake of a fair and honest review, I will keep bringing up how much the music slaps, but I will not be considering it towards the final score until proven otherwise. Once I can start differentiating between which games have better soundtracks or worse soundtracks, even if they all end up on the S tier, then we will utilize them in the final tier list rankings. Story. This is where the overall score takes a bit of a dip in my opinion, seeing what's achieved through these games, even across the next 5-year span of game development. The Heroes of Light are kind of dull in order to be player surrogates, and the plot is mostly the search for progressively less related items to solve a world crisis. Even the big twist villain reveal, while shocking and fun on a first playthrough, leaves players wanting more. Replace Garland with the Elf King or the Jolt Potion with smelling salts. Nothing changes as long as the Heroes of Light are as present as they are the second you boot up the game. You don't truly feel the weight of the Heroes of Light on the world around them, except in so much that they solved a problem and the benefits of that solution happen off screen. I'd give it a C. For comparison, we'll talk about the best and worst of the Final Fantasy plots as the series continues, and I think this one will be our example of inoffensive, if unmoving, plot work. Use of Final Fantasy tropes. Some solid groundwork is done here, and the universe is set up nicely, but you can clearly see other games' influences. which can take away from the universe's immersion. We're introduced to the role of time in perpetuating cycles, to in ever-changing peoples, some of which exhibit crazy technological skills while some wallow in the dirt, and some simply await a yet-fulfilled prophecy. Final Fantasy I shows us a world that is filled with history and tales, and races all with their own wants and needs. This leads to the player learning the importance of saving the only world we've ever called home. But there aren't any chocobos, so it's getting a B from me. And this means we're going to be landing firmly in the B category, which may change as we begin to compare one against some of the weaker games later in the series. So with that, I think our frank discussion of Final Fantasy I is complete. And like I said, I don't take notes. But I do love heated conversations, so take any observations, complaints, disagreements to the comments. Maybe I'll join the discourse. Or you can come speak up in chat next time we record gameplay for the next part of the series. Final Fantasy II, if you could believe it. See you in the next one.